Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be showing you how to set up your own custom settings in your Unity project using the settings provider. So the documentation that we'll be working off of today is the settings provider, and I'll provide a link to that in the description of the video. And this settings provider is really useful if you want to be able to create your own custom settings in your Unity project that you'll be able to access in any of your scripts without having that data attached to any game object or prefab. And you can access it in any of your scenes. And you might have already used the project settings before. We're basically just going to add our own custom tab in here, and we can manage our settings data however we want. And this is also really useful if you're thinking about building a package for the Unity Asset Store, or to share with other people that you're working with, or share between projects, because you can have your own custom settings for that asset, and it will be bundled together so that it'll show up in the project settings, and it's just a really clean, useful way of handling that. So to get started, we are just going to create this folder called editor, and it's important that you call it that because that's where Unity is going to look to get code that can be executed in the editor, and that's what we need to create project settings. So we're going to go into the editor, and I've already done this, but you create a C# script, you create two of them, one called custom settings and one called custom settings provider. So we're going to start off with the custom settings class. And first off, we're just going to start with the default script that Unity created. And we're going to add the Unity editor. And we're going to change this so we're not making a mono behavior, we're going to make a scriptable object. And this class will represent the actual structure of the settings data that we want to save to a file. And we're just going to get rid of these start and update functions. And I'm just going to copy in the starter info from the documentation that Unity gives. Oops. So we've got a few different things here. We have the path that we're going to store the data at, because we need to write these settings to an actual file so that they'll be saved. We've got some fields that they're giving us an example of. Getter create settings, which returns an instance of our class. They've named it differently, so I'm just going to do that before I forget. And another method that returns a serialized object. So this is our starting point. Now I'm going to change some things here, and I'll tell you why. So for the path, Unity has it set up to save this to assets/editor, and that's okay, but I actually want to be able to use these settings at runtime in my game. So I'm instead going to save it to the resources folder, and I'm going to call it custom settings to match the name of my class. And maybe I'll just change this to custom settings path. Okay, that's good. Now, these fields are the actual data that we're going to save. So if you go into the Unity editor, the project settings tab, you'll see those fields where you can actually enter numbers and strings and manage data. That's what we're setting up here. So the example that I'm going to use today is if we're building a game that had a big world in it with some different cities, I'm going to use Skyrim as an example, and we want to keep a list of those cities for whatever reason. Maybe we want to use them in the game somewhere. So I'm going to set that up as an example. So we have this serialized field annotation above it, above our field, and I'm actually going to make this a string array, and I will call it, let's see, cities. So this is the data that I want to save. Now, in getter create settings, first off, we're going to return. So the purpose of this function is to just return an instance of our settings object. So we're going to load this settings, and I don't know why I renamed this. This is going to get annoying, but we're going to load it. And if it isn't there, it's going to come back null, which means that we haven't created these settings yet. So we need to create just an initial version of that. So we're just going to make our one data type. It's going to be an empty array. Get rid of the other one. And we're going to create the asset. And then the serialized object basically just takes what we just made, our custom class instance, and it makes it into a serialized version that it can actually be written into the file so that it can be saved. And we're going to save that. All right, now let's move on to the custom settings provider. So I'm actually just going to overwrite this default class, again with content that's just coming right from the Unity documentation, which I will link below if you want to look over it. So we are now making a class that will implement the settings provider from the Unity editor. And let me get rid of that and rename this to match the name of the file. So we have our serialized object custom settings, and that is going to be coming from what we just created in the other file. We have some custom styles if you want to use that. These are for their default fields. I'm going to get rid of that for right now. And we have a path again. I'm just going to copy it over from the other one. So we're just going to put the same path here so that it's going to be loading from where we just created it. Call it custom settings again. We need a function to know if the settings are actually available, so if that file exists. So here we have the constructor for our settings provider. I'm just going to rename it so make sure that it's the same, just the name of your provider. And we have the path, and we have the settings scope. And this comes from the settings scope enum. It can either be user or project. If we set it to user, then the settings are going to show up in here under Unity settings, under preferences. And if we set it to project, it's going to show up under edit project settings. And we're going to use project settings today. So we can call it project. Now, next we have onActivate. And this is basically a function that will be called when the user first goes to our new settings tab. So this will basically just give us our custom settings. I'm not renaming this one. I'll just use their default. but this will be a reference to the class that we just made for our settings, and it'll use that getSerializedSettings method that we worked on. And then we can go down here, and on GUI is important. This will render the actual fields that we can use to edit our data. And it's just using the editor GUI layout.PropertyField, which I will also link in the description, and you can read more about all the different fields that are available. Depending on the data that you want to work with, you might set this up a little bit differently. You might use a different field type, but I'm just going to use property field because that's what we will use for a list, which is what I'm working on. So we have our custom settings, and we are finding the property cities, which is what we named back over here. And it's finding that in our serialized object. And I got rid of these styles, so I'm just going to get rid of them. Don't need that right now, I hope. And we can apply the changes that are made to these properties by calling this at the end. And then, this is important right here, we're annotating this next function with SettingsProvider, and this is telling Unity that this method is going to return an actual provider that it needs to render to that project settings window. So this will actually make your settings show up in that window. And we are returning a settings provider, and that is a class coming from Unity. So it's important that you didn't name your class settings provider. You named it custom. You don't want that to conflict. So we will return an instance of our custom settings provider, which is the parent class if settings are available, coming from up here. Setting scope is the project. And this is going to define how your what your settings are going to be called in those tabs. So what will show up there. And I'm going to call it, I don't know, city list. Sure, that's fine. And this is something to do with those styles that I deleted. Honestly, you can set up styles and look into that if you want. I find that this is, I never use them because I'm kind of just setting up more simple data to be stored, and I haven't needed to use them. So I actually don't know how they work. But you can let me know if you'd like a separate video on that. Okay, and this file will now be done. So we can go back to Unity, see how many errors we have waiting for us. Okay, so we have an error here, and I'm realizing I kind of messed up here. So we should not have done a string array like that. We should do a list. We'll just do a list of strings instead, and then new list of strings. And there we go. I don't think I need to change anything over here for that mistake. I've been working a lot in JavaScript, so. And it looks like we're missing an import. So let me go back to the Unity documentation, missing a visual element import. What is that? Probably one of these. just import both of them. Now, the namespace my custom settings couldn't be found. All right, that's due to me renaming stuff without needing to actually rename it. That's my bad. Ah, there it is. And the name file doesn't exist in the current context. That is definitely another import from system.io, I believe. No, it was over here. All right, there we go. Our errors are gone. Now, in theory, we should be able to go to our project settings and see, and of course we don't see it. That's how it goes. All right. Okay, I'm back after running into some problems and troubleshooting why our custom editor settings weren't showing up. And I went back and corrected a mistake I made at the beginning of the video. So I made a folder called scripts and put our scripts there. It actually should have been in the editor folder. So I went back and changed that. You might have noticed something called scripts in there. Just disregard that. It should be editor. That's where our scripts are now. And then we also need to create a folder called resources. And that needs to be there so that our script is able to put a file there. And this resources folder is important because this is a special folder where you can put assets that you want to be able to access at runtime. So when you're running the game, when you've built the game, maybe you're putting it on the App Store, whatever, just that's where you need to put assets that you want to be able to access. And it's important to be careful when you're using this, because if you're accessing files frequently, large files, I believe, it can have an impact on performance. At least that's what I read on the Unity forum at one point. You can let me know in the comments if you have any extra knowledge about these things that you can share with me. That'd be awesome. Anyways, I noticed one more problem in the setup. So from the Unity documentation, they have where we're creating this instance of the settings provider and registering it with Unity, they say only if the settings are available, meaning that file has been created in resources, we should return this provider. Which means that if that asset isn't there, it won't show anything in the project settings. Which I don't really get, because we have something right here to create it if it's not there. I'm not sure why Unity suggests this. If anyone knows and there's a good reason for it, please do comment and let me know. But I find that it works fine to just get rid of that. Take this, return it just directly from there, and then the first time you go and access that in the project settings, it'll just create the asset for you. So I'll do that. And we'll let that recompile. And now we should be able to go to our project settings and we see our city list. Okay, perfect. And we can just start adding some cities there, like Riften and Whiterun, Windhelm. Solitude and Markarth. All right, there we go. So now we have our cities. We can organize them. We can add and delete because we're using the array, we're using a list type and just passing it to that property field. And that's kind of why I love this property field. You can just pass your data in and it'll adapt to that, which I think is really cool. At least that is my understanding of that field. And I'm just going to close my editor and restart it, and ideally we will still see that data there because it has actually been persisted to that file. Back to our project settings, and we can see it, the items we added are still there, the order has stayed the same, so that is great. And I'm going to actually take this one step further today, and I'm just going to I'm going to show you how to actually access these settings in another script. Okay, so back in the Unity editor, we will actually just make a scripts folder. And we'll go in there and make a new script. Doesn't matter what it is. This is just a quick demo. So I'll just call it my script. Okay, and in my script, you can see I've just added this function, and we could actually make it public if we wanted. No, let's not make it public. And we can just make a settings object. Oops. Some settings, load custom settings. And this will give us the resource, or sorry, the asset that was created in the resources folder. That's how Unity is able to access that. So we can just go back and we can see this custom settings asset was created in that folder, and we can actually just load that with resources.load in any of our scripts. All right, that is an overview of how I like to use the settings provider from Unity to create custom settings in my games. I've created an asset for the Unity asset store that uses this type of thing as part of a system for managing levels in a level-based game. So let's say like Candy Crush, you have thousands of levels, and being able to manage those effectively. I've been building games that are level-based, and it was such a pain. So I built this asset, and that's been really useful for me. And just any settings that you might need to access across any of your scenes where it doesn't make sense to attach it to any particular game object or a prefab, level settings can be really, really useful. So I hope you learned something from this, and let me know in the comments if you have any advice, feedback, or things that you'd like me to make a video on. And thanks for checking out my channel. See you next time.